rain pounded against the windows of Mark's apartment like tiny angry fists. It had been 3 weeks since he'd lost his job, and the gray skies matched his mood perfectly. His refrigerator contained nothing but condiments and a carton of milk that had probably gone bad. With a sigh, he grabbed his umbrella and headed out into the storm. The neighborhood grocery store was only 6 blocks away, but in this weather, it might as well have been miles. Head down against the wind, Mark didn't notice the trembling shape huddled under the awning of the closed bookshop until he nearly tripped over it. It was a dog, a medium-sized mutt with matted fur, so soaked and dirty that it was impossible to tell its original color. The animal looked up at Mark with eyes that seemed too intelligent, too aware of its own misery. "Hey there," Mark said softly, crouching down. No collar. The dog was thin, ribs visible beneath its wet coat, but it didn't growl or shy away when Mark reached out a tentative hand. Mark had never owned a pet. His ex-girlfriend had been allergic, and after she left, he'd been too busy chasing promotions to consider the responsibility. Now, with no job and dwindling savings, taking in a stray was the last thing he should be doing. "I'm heading to the store," he told the dog, feeling ridiculous for talking to an animal. "You stay here, okay?" The dog tilted its head, those eyes still fixed on Mark's face. At the grocery store, Mark found himself in the pet aisle, staring at dog food. Before he knew it, he had added a small bag of kibble, a collar, and a leash to his basket alongside his own meager groceries. When he returned to the bookshop, he was certain the dog would be gone. But there it was, in exactly the same spot as if it had named the dog Chance. It seemed fitting. After a bath revealed a golden brown coat and a trip to the vet confirmed he was healthy despite being undernourished, Chance settled into Mark's apartment as if he'd always belonged there. The job search continued to yield nothing but rejections, and Mark's savings dwindled faster than expected, especially with the added expense of caring for Chance. But the dog's presence gave structure to his days and a reason to get out of bed in the morning. One particularly discouraging afternoon, after receiving yet another form rejection email, Mark sat on the floor with his back against the couch, eyes closed in defeat. Chance nudged his hand with a cold nose, then dropped something in his lap. It was a flyer, one that Mark had discarded earlier that week, advertising a community job fair in the park. "You think I should give it a shot, huh?" Mark scratched behind Chance's ears. The dog's tail thumped against the floor. The job fair was crowded, with dozens of hopeful applicants clustered around too few tables. Mark was about to leave when Chance, who had been unusually well-behaved on his leash, suddenly pulled hard toward a booth at the far end with only a few people waiting. The woman behind the table smiled as Mark approached, her eyes immediately going to Chance. "What a beautiful dog," she said. "What's his name?" "Chance," Mark replied, noticing the logo on her display. "A local security company. Well-behaved too," she observed, reaching out to let Chance sniff her hand. "We've started to say no, but then thought about the tricks he'd taught Chance over the past few weeks. Some, he admitted, but I'm a quick learner." 2 interviews later, Mark had a job. Not his dream position, but one with growth potential and, more importantly, a steady paycheck. He was assigned to work with the company's dog trainer, and his afternoons were spent learning how to train security dogs. Chance came along every day, serving as an unofficial mascot for the new program. 6 months passed. Mark had been promoted to assistant trainer, and life had settled into a comfortable routine. Then came the night that changed everything. Mark woke to Chance's frantic barking, a sound he'd never heard from the normally calm dog. The air in the apartment felt strange, thicker somehow. When Mark tried to stand, a wave of dizziness hit him, and he collapsed back onto the bed. Chance's barking grew more urgent. The dog jumped onto the bed, pulling at Mark's sleeve with his teeth, trying to drag him toward the door. Through his growing confusion, Mark realized what was happening: gas leak. He tried to crawl, but his limbs felt leaden. Chance stayed beside him, encouraging him forward with nudges and tugs until they reached the front door. Mark's fingers fumbled with the lock, his vision blurring. With one final effort, he turned the knob and collapsed into the hallway. The building's alarm system began to wail as other residents emerged from their apartments. Someone called 911. Mark remembered very little after that until he woke up in the hospital with an oxygen mask over his face and Chance's photo on the nightstand, brought by a nurse who'd heard the story. "Your dog saved your life." Weeks later, Mark and Chance were back in their apartment building, which had been declared safe after repairs. Life resumed its rhythm, but with a deeper appreciation for the bond they shared. Then, on a crisp fall morning during their usual run in the park, disaster struck. A group of children were playing near the pond when a ball sailed over the fence and splashed into the water. Before anyone could react, a small girl climbed through the fence bars and reached for it, losing her balance and tumbling into the pond. The pond wasn't deep for an adult, but for a 4-year-old, it was another story. The girl's panic thrashing told Mark she couldn't swim. He sprinted toward the water, but Chance was faster, leaping the fence in a single bound and plunging into the pond. By the time Mark reached them, Chance had the back of the girl's jacket between his teeth and was struggling to pull her toward the shore. Mark waded in and lifted the coughing, sputtering child into his arms. As the girl's grateful parents wrapped her in a jacket, Mark noticed Chance limping heavily on the shore. The dog tried to walk but collapsed with a high-pitched whine that cut through Mark like a knife. "Something's wrong with his leg," Mark told the park ranger who had arrived on the scene. "I need to get him to a vet immediately." The diagnosis was grim, a torn ligament that would require expensive surgery. Without it, Chance would never walk properly again. The cost was more than 2 months of Mark's salary and "Sorry," the vet said, seeing Mark's face fall. "There are payment plans, but they'd still require a substantial deposit up front." That night, Mark sat beside Chance's bed on the floor of their apartment, gently stroking the sedated dog's head. "You saved me twice," he whispered. "First by coming into my life when I needed someone, then from the gas leak. Now it's my turn to save you, buddy. I promise." The next morning, Mark listed his vintage guitar collection, the one luxury he'd kept from his previous life, on several online marketplaces. By afternoon, he had a buyer. By evening, he had the deposit for Chance's surgery. The vet was optimistic, but recovery would be long. For weeks, Mark carried Chance up and down the stairs to their apartment, administered medications, and performed the physical therapy exercises the vet had demonstrated. His coworkers at the security company, hearing the story, organized a surprise fundraiser that covered the remainder of Chance's medical bills. The local news picked up the story of the rescue dog who had become a rescuer, and soon offers came in for Mark to bring Chance to schools to teach children about pet responsibility and water safety. 1 year later, Mark stood in the park where Chance had saved the little girl. The security company had promoted him to head their expanded Canine division, and he now helped train service dogs for people with disabilities. Small ceremony was underway, the unveiling of a new safety fence around the pond, funded by donations that had poured in after their story made the news. The little girl Chance had saved, now 5 years old, giggled as she petted him. "Sometimes the things that seem like our biggest challenges turn out to be our greatest blessings," Mark told the small crowd. "I thought I was rescuing a dog from the rain, but in the end, he rescued me in more ways than I can count." Chance looked up at him with those same intelligent eyes that had caught Mark's attention that rainy day, and Mark knew with absolute certainty that they had saved each other. As they walked home together under a clear blue sky, Mark reflected on how much had changed since that stormy day. He had lost a job but found a calling. He had been alone but now had a companion who understood him better than any human ever had. Sometimes Mark realized